Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Karen Kramer. She is Professor of Anthropology at the University of Utah. Her research interests span behavioral ecology, demography, comparative life history, and reproductive ecology, the evolution of juvenility, cooperative breeding, intergenerational transfers, and the interaction between economic and demographic transitions. The question that unifies her research is, why do humans have the unparalleled capacity for population growth compared to closely related species? And those are the topics we're going to talk about today. So, Dr. Kramer, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you. Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, great. So let's start with life history. So I would like to ask you first, in what ways does human life history differ from the life histories of other closely related species?
Okay, well, probably first, since you've got a wide audience, so
Right.
what do we mean? What do we mean by life history? So that in biology, we take that to mean the allocation of time and energy to all the different important events in the species' life. So life history determines how long you gestate, if you're a mammal, how long you spend breastfeeding, when you get weaned, when to mature, uh, when to have your firstborn offspring, and even when to die. So so that's what we mean by life history. And I guess humans are usually characterized as having a very slow, drawn out life history. That's sort of the conventional way that we have been characterized. And that's primarily because we do take a fair bit of time to grow and develop and produce our first offspring. So if we were to compare humans to an animal of similar size, and we do that just so that we can spotlight on what is interesting about humans. We do take a long time to start to reproduce, and we also live really long lives. I mean, impressively now today, but also probably in the archaeological past and perhaps in the distant past, we live fairly long lives. So humans have been characterized as having a slow life history, but I think that that's only half the story. And I think it's a shame because what's really to me interesting about humans is that we actually have a hybrid. So we also have a really fast life history in that we reproduce really quickly. So yes, we spend a long time getting to the gate, as it were, to reproduce, and then we reproduce really quickly. And so I think that's what that it's that combination that we live these long drawn out lives but reproduce really fast that gives human life history its interesting twist and sets us apart in terms of parenting, childhood, cooperation, and other essential features of humans.
So it's because we have these comparatively slow life histories that we have cooperative breeding in our societies.
Well, I would say it's the combination of both. So, for example, a non-human great ape, they are also are large-brained primates. They basically deal with the fact that it takes a long time to grow your brain by having these long, drawn-out infancies. So they are dependent upon their moms. They aren't weaned. Maybe if you're a chimpanzee at age of 5 or so, if you're an orangutan, it's a lot longer, maybe 7 or 8. And so they have very few offspring over the course of their lifespan. So they can deal with that without help. So I guess first I should explain cooperative breeding. What do we mean by that? That again is a term that comes out of biology, evolutionary biology, that is the recognition that in some species, in some few but diverse species, individuals other than parents help to raise offspring, help to raise children. And this is something of an evolutionary conundrum because why would I help raise some individual that's not my progeny, that I have no genetic, in a sense, self-interest in? So humans are, I think, without a doubt, cooperative breeders, but it's the combination. It's not that we take a long time to mature. Moms could handle having a couple of offspring over the course of their life history. It's the fact that she has them really quickly, and the fact that we have what are called sometimes stacked births. I have referred to it as multiple dependents of different ages. And we aren't completely unique in that way, but we are very unusual in the sense that there's a classic picture of an Ache. These are hunters and gatherers that live in Paraguay in South America. And the mom is holding a newborn. She also has a toddler who wants her attention, and she's got another baby. So she's got 3 children under the age of 4. And basically no other primate does that, and then she's out foraging, and what is she supposed to do? She's got her hands full with kids, and she's out collecting food to take home to her older children who are back at camp. So that's in a cartoon nutshell, what human moms today are up against. And let me just say that I'm going to be referring a lot to what we call natural fertility societies. So those are societies that don't orchestrate the timing of birth with birth control. So we do it completely differently. We can have none, 1, 2 kids because we have the availability of systematic birth control.
Yeah, so when it comes to human parenting, again comparing to other species, are there aspects of human parenting that are unique to us?
Yes, so I would say there's really 2 features that are very unique to us, and one of them is that because we have basically over evolutionary time, mothers cut short the period of time that they spend breastfeeding. So we have very short, we're breastfed humans, again, in a natural fertility society where they don't have bottles and formula and stuff. Kids are weaned between the ages of 2 and 3. A chimpanzee is weaned at about twice that age. Although we know the quality of the milk really diminishes in those older chimpanzee infants. So what we've done is we've cut infancy way short, which avails calories to mothers. So mothers across the animal world, mothers can rarely fund both lactation and pregnancy. You basically make a choice. I'm either going to be pregnant or I'm going to be lactating. It's very calorically demanding to do both things. So because she's now given up those lactation calories, she can prepare her body for pregnancy again. But of course, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old is not ready just to hey mom, I'm gone, I'll go get my own food, don't worry about me anymore. That very young child is still needing of adult resources or resources from its older siblings. So we also take care of our weanlings and our juveniles in terms of parenting, and that's pretty unusual in the animal world. A chimpanzee it'll be weaned, it'll hang out with its mom, it'll no doubt receives protection, support socially from its mom, but it doesn't receive food. And again, obviously the 3, the 4, the 5-year-old, even at that age, they can get a lot of their own food, they can't get all of their own food. So the fact that we take care of juveniles, feed them, is fairly unprecedented in the animal world. And then the other thing we just mentioned is that we are cooperative breeders. And while it's not unique among primates, there are about 5% of mammals that are cooperative breeders, our estimates. But the other great apes are not cooperative breeders. So as evolutionary anthropologists, we're interested in how it is that we come to be so cooperative in our nature. Yeah.
Are there any major sex differences in human parenting? So, just to give an example, is it really the case that mothers invest more than fathers on average in their children, or not?
So yes, humans are, as Sarah Hurdy would say, we're like the rest of the animal kingdom in that it is females who invest more in offspring than males. On average, you're right to put that in there because, of course, there's a lot of individual variation. So my research has shown that mothers, for example, and I found this quite startling, that they only provide, so from an infant's point of view, you can ask the question, how much time, who gives the care that I receive? So if I'm a little infant, who holds me, who carries me, who bathes me, who breastfeeds me? And we find that of the care that infants receive across many different human societies, only 50% is provided by the mother. So that means, yeah, which is surprisingly low. I've never found comparable values for other primates, but it seems relatively high to me. That means a whole lot of other people are helping. So one finger has certainly been pointed to the importance of fathers, and there's no doubt in contemporary societies, whether they're hunters and gatherers or Western post-industrial societies, dads are important players. There's a lot of debate over their importance evolutionarily and how deep that would have gone. So there are many anthropologists and archaeologists that think of male parental care as emerging very early in human evolution. And there are others that, like myself, who think it probably emerged not late, but probably not as the first. Dads were probably not the first helpers for mothers. The importance of fathers has largely been placed in their well, I think there's been perhaps an over emphasis on the contribution of dads in some contexts. And what I mean by that is that at least archaeologically and as arguments are made deep in the past, there's been a lot of attention paid to hunting and to the importance of hunting. And I think we do know cross-culturally, it seems pretty evident that men are very important hunters. They're very important contributors of protein to the diet. But there's a lot of other food that people eat, and women's contributions to the diet have really, I think, been understated, understudied, and unobserved. In part, archaeologically, what preserves in the archaeological record? Stones and bones. So you're going to see hunting. You're not going to necessarily see the contributions that women make in terms of plant foods. And so we really need to balance that out because there's no reason to not expect that women, as they do today, contribute a lot to the diet.
Right. So in your work, I read about female energetics. So could you tell us what that is about and perhaps if it plays a role in things like fertility, child rearing, etc.?
Right. So I think what you're referring to there, or what we would mean by female energetics in that context. So energetics is just energy, calories in, calories out, and how that balances out. Where that becomes important in terms of female reproduction is what I kind of had mentioned earlier, is that for a human female, pregnancy is very expensive. It varies over the course of the 9 months, but we can average it to be about 500 calories a day. So we easily solve that. We go to the store and buy a Snickers bar or something, whatever the equivalent is in Portugal or wherever you are in the world. And industrial societies, women, we have access to calories. That's easy to solve. But for a hunter-gatherer female, that's kind of a challenge. And breastfeeding is actually even more expensive. It's about Again, it changes over the course of those 2 to 3 years, but about 600 calories a day. And then there's the energy that you have to spend as a woman going out and foraging and getting food for your offspring, which is an additional cost. So basically, women can maybe do 2 out of 3. They can't do all of those things. They can't both be pregnant, take care of their little ones, and take care of their older ones at the same time. And so over the course of human ancestry, choices or trade-offs are made between which of those things that I can fund, and which of those things that I do. As I mentioned, because we cut infancy short, moms are a little bit in a pickle. They're saving a lot of calories because lactation is the most expensive thing that a woman does reproductively, but we then have to feed these older kids.
Right. So in traditional societies, and when I say traditional societies, I'm referring to hunter-gatherers mostly, do we see lots of teen motherhood?
Yes, we do. I would say that teen motherhood is the human norm. If we look at it, it gets a very bad rap in again, post-industrial societies for a good reason. But in a traditional, if we look across all kinds of what we call small-scale societies or non-industrialized societies, hunters and gatherers, agriculturalists, pastoralists, herders, the average human age at first birth is 19 and a half. So those are teens, they're older teens. And I guess what my research has shown among hunters and gatherers is that the reason that one would be concerned about, well, the question I asked was, how young is too young? So, because in the group of hunters and gatherers that I work with, I have there's a very early age at first birth, about 15 and a half. No matter how you run the numbers, these girls are pretty young. Where we become biologically concerned about that is if they're not fully developed. So there are a lot of compromises to very young teens, especially if their pelvis and their pelvic bones are not mature. That is the last bone in the female body that completely matures. So there's good reason, and there's also good reason, to be concerned. Do you live in a society where teen motherhood is sanctioned? Is it supported? Is it okay? Well, in traditional societies, it's completely okay. That's the norm. That's what people are doing. There's lots of social support in many traditional societies. You grow up with your mom, your grandmother, your aunts, your younger sisters. You have lots and lots of social support, and we're not trading off our time or biding our time with education. So there's not the concern that if I start to reproduce at 19, I'm not going to be fully trained to lead a successful adulthood. So yes, teen motherhood, what we found was that among the Savannah Pumé, who are the hunters and gatherers that I work with in Venezuela, that we had this early age, average age at first birth. And so then we were curious, okay, are they doing, in a sense, the adaptive thing? Or are they doing something maladaptive by having this early age at first birth? So we looked at women who gave birth younger than that. Of course, there's variation around that average. And we found that, yes, indeed, 13, 14-year-olds had a much higher, a 4 times higher probability of losing that baby. Again, most likely because of their biological immaturity. However, girls that waited until they were 20 or 21 had no lower probability of losing their firstborn than did those 15-year-olds. So in a sense, we can say what the average Pumé, what the norm is among them, is in a sense the adaptive thing. If you waited, we also know that you would have fewer children over the course of your reproductive career, which from a fitness or natural selection point of view is not optimal. If that answers your question, yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned the Pumé from Venezuela. What are there any other aspects of their sociality that you've studied?
Well, yes. I went there. My research interest is in the evolution of cooperation, in particular children's cooperation. Um, and I had studied that in another group in Mexico extensively. And I wanted to work with a group of hunters and gatherers to see if it was different, given the real difference in subsistence base. And I did study that, but I also got sidetracked or went into a new direction in terms of one of the first things you do when you go to the field is you have to get to know people. And so you collect what we call reproductive histories. So you sit families down and you ask about who their ascendant generation is, who their parents are, who their brothers and sisters are, and then who their collateral generation is, how many siblings they have, and then how many children they have. And you find out as many details about all of that as you possibly can. And I became very curious about this really early age at first birth, as well as the very high infant mortality that we were finding. So, and then I got very interested in children's growth and development, why they mature earlier, etc. Mm-hmm.
So, by studying the Pumé and the other people in Mexico, did you get any new insights into aspects of human sociality that previously anthropologists didn't know about, or that perhaps they didn't get from studying other societies?
Well, there's so many insights, both very human insights, as well as, of course, our research or academic insights that we get from living very intimately with people who live such completely different lives than our own. But I guess to the research question, I learned, yes, it became very clear to me. I went in originally thinking that kind of what was the conventional idea at the time, that kids were these kind of passive players on the evolutionary stage. They did very little. They basically were these hungry mouths that parents had to feed, and they were not really much, they didn't participate very much. And I've come out of it then, as well as many years later, really convinced that it is kids they're the ones who float the human story in terms of our life history, in terms of this rapid reproductive rate. What our studies have shown is that, yes, dads are helping. In both the societies I've spent 25 years or more working, in both cases, dads are very important players. They aren't in all societies. In these two societies, they are. But they still can't cut it. They need help, and it's their kids that are filling in. And it makes, I guess, kids weren't really looked at before. They were kind of, they weren't paid much attention to. We paid much more attention to adults. And I think when you really start to look at what they're doing and collect the behavioral observation data, you do find that they are doing a lot of stuff. They're not sitting around all the time. They are playing a lot, but they're also watching their siblings. They're spending time foraging. They're spending time harvesting. And importantly, they're spending time food processing. So one thing that humans do that's really different from other animals is we almost eat no raw food. We process our food. And who does that but women and children? And we didn't really, we focused a lot on the food coming into camps, who was actually bringing food in, who was producing food, but how did it get from that stage to the stage at which humans actually eat it? And that's called food processing. And we didn't really kind of quantify that. And when you quantify that, you see how important women and children are to the story.
Right.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask you now about another specific aspect of your work. Um, is the capacity for population growth in human societies unusual from an evolutionary perspective?
So that's a really interesting question, and uh, let's see. So I guess first, what I'll just say is that what is population growth? It is the combination of fertility. It's basically the number of people who are alive on the planet at any given time, and that is driven by fertility, which we paid a lot of attention to until maybe 20 years ago, but also and mortality. And then if we're looking within the globe, it's about migration. So it's about the number of surviving infants, um, mortality, fertility, and the number of adults, the number of older people. So you can imagine, just if you break it down like that there's different factors affecting each of those throughout human history. So one thing we have done in the last 200-300 years is we have way diminished infant mortality. Of course, it is still high. It's still high in the hunters and gatherers that I work with. It's still very high. Um, but in terms of across the globe, in most parts of the world, we have dramatically brought down infant mortality, not just in Western industrialized societies, but also across Africa. Even though it's still higher than we would like it to be, it has been diminished significantly. So, so to the question is, are we unusual? We have the potential, I think, for millions of years to have been unusual because of this fast human life history. So the potential has been there. I think that the big story is in juvenile survivorship. So the fact, if it's interesting, if you break down children's survivorship into infants and juveniles, what you find is that infants in hunters and gatherers have really have no higher probability of surviving than does a chimpanzee infant. So in other words, human hunter-gatherer moms are doing as much as they can, they can't do any more than a chimpanzee mom does to keep their infants alive. The big rub is in juveniles. So when those infants are weaned, those chimpanzee infants are weaned, they have to find their own food. So they're not very good at it, they're not very experienced at it, and consequently, they often suffer because of it, both in terms of morbidity and mortality. We feed our juveniles, and so they do much, much better. So that improvement, juvenile survivorship, we probably made those gains a long time ago. The play today, in terms of population growth, is all about old people surviving. And that is just, so your audiences may be familiar with the population growth curve. So let me see if I can do it so the way you'd be looking at it. It's relatively flat, but not completely flat. So from the time our species emerges, maybe 200,000 years ago, to the year 1800, there are 1 billion people put on the planet. That's not unimpressive, but in the long run, it looks pretty flat. And then around 1800, you get this uptick. And then at 1900, you get this exponential growth. So I think when my father was born, the world doubled between his birth and my birth, and it's, I think, gone up fourfold since my birth. So it is, we've seen this exponential. That's mostly about old age survivorship.
Right, but do we know what are some of the main factors that drive rates of population growth in human societies?
Yes, we do. So it would be the combination of deaths and births. That's what, and then if you're looking at within a country, it would be migration. Yeah, so it's whatever. I mean, there's a lots of factors that affect fertility and mortality, of course, but it basically comes down to the number of people that are alive. So yes, people look further, demographers look further under the hood at what affects fertility and fertility decisions. There's a gigantic literature in that, and mortality.
Right. But is there any relationship between economy and demography? I mean, the type of economy that characterizes a given society and its demography?
Um, Certainly at a very uh, um, gross level or a very general level. So there are certainly demands and incentives to have large families in traditional hunting and gathering, herding, agricultural societies. Kids help a lot, and it's no huge cost to have these large families. And they're not, what kids are doing with their time is not being competed, helping out either in the fields or foraging or with the herds or taking care of their siblings or carrying water or cutting firewood or collecting fruit or hunting or whatever. They do all different things. That's not competing with school, and so they can just focus on that stuff. So in a very general way, then when we move to industrialized societies and we value education as in formal education, going to school, which means hours over here rather than hours over there, that starts to then compete, and you basically can't afford to have those, in a sense, those large families. The Maya, who I work with in Mexico and have worked with for the last almost 30 years, they are very interesting because they did get the introduction of schools since I've worked with them, and they will say very articulately what in economics is called the quantity-quality trade-off, also called that in behavioral ecology. And they will say specifically, if I had fewer children, I could send them to school. So they realize in what we call the opportunity cost of, like, do I keep my kids at home to help on the family farm, or do I send them to school? And they also, though, express a great deal of uncertainty about whether sending their kids to school and foregoing that help is really going to further their children's lives. In a big picture, what we call I think the public knows more is by the term globalization, or what we call market integration. Yes, there is an effect at its most simplest, because there's this trade-off with how kids spend their time and education, and how it is that we grow up to be successful adults. But just to be mindful that there's a ton of individual variation as well. Yes. Mm-hmm.
Right. Is there a relationship between population growth and social cooperation?
That's a harder question to answer, and I don't think there's no real, maybe obvious answer to that, except to say that if population growth is high because of high fertility, then supporting large families, is shouldered by the cooperation of many individuals. I mean, that's a really interesting question. Are we any less or whatever, in a post-industrial society, are we any less cooperative? Number of studies suggest that we are. We are less cooperative than in a traditional society. Because I think the confound in part is that in most low population growth societies are industrialized societies, where we do have, 1 to 2 kids, and that raising kids is often shouldered by institutions rather than by family. I mean, there's, again, a great deal of variation. There's been some interesting studies, for example, showing that grandfathers who aren't particularly important in traditional societies are much more important in industrialized societies. So it shifts, in terms of who we have because we have smaller families in Western societies or in industrialized societies. Because we have smaller families, we also have fewer what we call collateral kin. So, and especially if your mother came from a smaller family as well, then you have fewer aunts and uncles than maybe previous generations. You have fewer cousins. So the whole family system starts to contract. And then we move all the time. At least Americans move all the time. And so we don't live near, our relatives. And so we start to rely on institutions. So I don't know good question, is our nature, I think that a lot of the evolutionary psychologists are maybe struggling with this question. Are we, in fact, less cooperative, or have we just sort of shifted our focus? In terms of cooperative breeding, we know that we are relying on different individuals to help raise kids. While we only have 1 to 2 kids, they take a whole lot of more resources, each one of them, right? And this is where the grandfathers become important, maybe not so much for direct care, but for the checks that they write so that those kids can go to school, etc. So it's shifted, and certainly we rely upon governments, daycare centers, schools, they take care of children. So we rely upon different sources to take care of kids.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to ask about another aspect of human sociality. Could you tell us what are dispersal patterns?
Okay, so yes, I have become very interested in that, working with hunters and gatherers. Human dispersal is interesting because we do all manner of it. And again, for the people listening, what do we mean by that? Most animals, including humans, live in small groups. So, it's only relatively recent in human evolutionary history that we live in big cities with lots of social options in terms of who you might marry when you grow up or who you might mate with when you grow up. And for most of human history, in most animals, we lived in small groups of maybe 50, 60, 70 individuals. And that's big for a primate. That's a big group for a primate. So what that means is that when I do mature, maybe there's someone in my group I can marry that I'm not too closely related to. But it also means that I probably need to look beyond the horizon for someone I'm not closely related to. So other animals seem to solve this by there being pretty regular patterns about one sex emigrating. So in other words, I grew up in a group and it's either the gals all leave or the guys all leave. In primates, it's usually the males that leave, except in chimpanzees, it's the females who leave. So it's not strict. I mean, are exceptions, but there seems to be these patterns where one sex leaves so that you minimize inbreeding, is the thought. And in humans, we do it all. I mean, males leave, females leave, neither leave, some come in, some, whatever. We have a very diverse, what we do when we sexually mature and live in a small group, what we do is highly diverse cross-culturally.
And is it influenced by adult sex ratios?
So the question of sex ratios, I became interested in that because, again, living and working in a small hunter-gatherer population, the question is like, what's a girl to do when she matures, or what's a guy to do when he matures? And this rests upon the observation that in small groups, for no reason except for just random biological processes. Sometimes there's a lot of girls born, sometimes there's a lot of boys born, and that fluctuates from year to year. But, so for example, with the Savannah Pumé that I work with, the first year that we were there, there was one boy and 8 girls between like the ages of 5 and 12. So that means when those girls all reach maturity in another couple of years, they aren't going to have any choice. So if you were another kind of animal and the females didn't leave, you'd have to sit there and basically twiddle your thumbs until there was a guy available. And that's really costly in terms of fitness. You can't do that. Humans solve this in a brilliant way. So to basically deal with these unbalanced sex ratios when you become an adult and trying to find mates, we have these brilliant social strategies that basically give pretty much everyone a chance to marry and reproduce. And we do that, I think I have to pin the tail here on language, mostly, is that we have, Bernard Chapet has had a lot to say about this. We have relationships across many, many communities, even hunters and gatherers. They know, even hundreds of miles away, where their kin are, where their distant kin are, and who they could call upon if when their daughter comes of age, and to get access to that community and basically socially negotiate a place for that girl, either for a boy to move in or for her to move out, and it works in all directions. So we have these very clever ways that other animals don't have, basically through language and how we keep track of family relationships, that we are able to, in a sense, overcome those imbalances in sex ratios that happen when you live in a small group.
And do these sex ratios also influence family formation?
I would say yes. In traditional societies, the other option, the other option is to marry polygynously. So yes, if there's an imbalance, if there's a small imbalance, you can join a marriage that already exists, and that works both in terms of polygyny, males taking multiple wives, or women taking multiple husbands. So that's one way to solve. But no one, well, I guess I shouldn't say that. I was going to say no one is particularly happy in a polygamous marriage. That's not true. But at least in hunters and gatherers, they tend to be, there's low numbers and they tend to be fairly brittle. So, other options are usually come up with. I think we have done some research then turning to industrialized societies, looking at the effect of sex ratios on family formation. And so, just to turn it away from traditional societies to our, the kinds of societies we live in, or whatever, in industrialized societies. So there is a conventional, both in the popular literature and the academic literature, that when you get a male-biased society, when you get more males than females, that's grossly exaggerated, those are very unstable societies. And that idea comes from the notion that males are competitive, they compete for females, and that males are both the perpetrators and the victims of violence more than females are. So it's the idea that if you get too many men in a society, it's going to wreak havoc and become very unstable, high levels of violence. And China is sort of the classic case, and India, a classic example that's often given of this. So there's been a lot of alarmist, especially journalistic writing, about how in China over the next decade there will be, an estimated 20 million excess males, and how we prepare for that kind of inevitable social unrest that would follow. So, but there's also, but that idea has never really been, well, there's not a lot of empirical study if that's actually true. It seems to make sense, right? A lot of men, they like to compete, could be really unstable. But people haven't really looked at it that closely. There's a growing number of scholars, both demographers and anthropologists, that have looked at that. And so we took that question to the US Census. And so we looked at 2,800 counties in 50 states, it's pretty much all the counties in the US. And we looked at, are those counties that are more or less male biased, have more men than women, what do their markers for family stability look like? So markers for family stability are things like the number of men that are married, the percentage of males that are married, the percentage of females that are married, the number of unwed mothers, and households headed female or single gender headed households. Okay, so these are the classic demography markers of family stability. And what we found was that no, in male biased counties, there was actually greater stability, not lower stability. And the idea there is that, yes, if you get an excess of men, sure, they're going to compete, but that doesn't mean they're going to bludgeon each other. We also, as humans, we also compete in other ways. We compete in terms of being who's the best dad. We know in today's, at least in the US and today, there's a lot of signaling about, like, I'm the better dad. I know I have more puppies than you have, or whatever. I know I spend more time caring for my child. I mean, there's a lot of ways that males compete, including being really good fathers and being good husbands. And so I think the idea is that, yes, males may be competing, but we maybe don't need to be so alarmed about unbalanced sex ratios in terms of leading to societal instability and violence.
Yeah, that's interesting because, for example, I remember the work done by Martin Daly and Margot Wilson, and for example, of course, I'm not sure if they touch on sex ratios or not, but at least in societies and places where there's higher levels of perceived inequality because it's harder for males at the bottom of the social hierarchy to get access to females, they compete more violently. So I don't know if there would be any relation with what you're saying or not.
Right. I think these studies, I mean, this door has just sort of been cracked open that we rethink this. And there are some interesting studies even coming out of China that are sort of supporting that we need to rethink that excess, male biased societies are not necessarily what we think them to be. But I think the question lies in where we needed to go as the next step in our study was, what are unmarried men doing versus married men? So in other words, if there's more men around than women, once you get, and I use married because that's with big population data sets, it's very different than working in small populations, which I usually do. But with big populations, you don't know that much individual information. So marriages are registered. That's why we talk about marriage. But they lost my train of thought there for a second. But what those married men are doing, if they marry, they may hunker down and stay in those marriages, whereas the unmarried males, there may be something completely different going on there. And I think we need to look at whether there's different strategies for married and unmarried males. I think, yeah, that's definitely the next step that research needs to go.
Yeah, I get it. Okay, so let me just ask you about one last topic. So talking about human mating systems, things like monogamy, polygamy, and the different forms of polygamy out there. So do we know or can we say if humans have a preferred mating system? Like, for example, are humans monogamous?
So to that question, monogamous, I would say a resounding no. So there's a problem here, there's an issue here with the semantics. Humans are clearly pair bonders. That's true. But you can be a pair bonder if it's just one man and one woman. You're a pair bonder as well as if you're two women married to one man, or the other way around, two men married to one woman. So we definitely establish these long-term stable relationships that we can call pair bonds. And they can come in different forms. They can be monogamous, they can be polygynous, or they can be polyandrous. I don't need the devil's in the details. But I don't need to go into really any detail that using monogamy to be synonymous with pair bonding, I think has led to a lot of confusion in both the biological and in the human literature. So I just, I want to make that clear is, what most people mean when they say monogamous is they mean a pair bond, but it actually has created a lot of confusion because it does. Most societies sanction polygyny. So most societies sanction that, the majority of societies, whether we consider that most, sanction the fact that a man can take more than two wives. I'm at the University of Utah. That actually is now legal in the state of Utah. Ironically, they use the word polygamy. So polygamy refers to either a man or a woman taking on plural spouses. They probably really intended to say polygyny. So anyway, all kinds of marriage systems are now legal in the state of Utah. Just an aside. So I would say humans do it all. So we do pair bond. I think we can say that is a universal across human societies, but that is certainly not the only way that we make liaisons with each other. We have all manner of other kinds of ways that we make relationships, but we are pair bonders as well.
Yeah, so one last question. What is the explanation for the predominant mating system in a given society? So, for example, either it is monogamy, polyandry, or polygyny. I mean, is it explained, for example, by ecological factors?
Well, there are gross trends, and there's lots of exceptions. So, just to have that in mind, that there's always a ton of caveats when we try to generalize mating systems as well as many other traits. So many hunter-gatherer societies allow or sanction polygyny. Mm-hmm. So when anthropologists first started categorizing human societies as, one thing or another, it was, kind of 100 years ago. And the MO was you went into a community, you talked to the head man, and you asked them kind of what was allowable. So in other words, what's the cultural rule? What's the cultural norm? And so anthropologists marked this down, and it turned out that most human societies then are polygynous. But if you then, go in deeper and look at the detail, if you look what individuals are doing within a society, you find that, for example, in the Pumé that I work with, their textbook, they are 20% of marriages, are 20% of adults were polygynously married at some point over their life course. So that means most people are lifetime monogamous. Okay, so that's an important distinction. So while they sanction or tolerate or accept a polygynous marriage, that's not what most people are doing. Most people are monogamously married. So, we see, and then I guess if we wanted to kind of come up with sort of a general rule or way of looking at it, that when males are able to monopolize resources, they're also able to monopolize women, which means they can marry multiple women, or in some cases the other way around. So in most hunter-gatherers, males don't monopolize tradable resources, exchangeable resources. I mean, you're mobile, you're moving around. It's like actually anything that thwarts your mobility is a drag on you, and you're not going to do. So there's a good reason why there's not a lot of unbridled polygyny. So once, and this is not a linear historic transition because there's many hunters and gatherers in the world today, but those people that started to do agriculture or especially herding, you're then able to accumulate resources so you can, put double the land under cultivation or have a huge herd of cattle. And then you can, and we see this everywhere in the world, men start to trade those for younger wives, healthier wives, better connected wives, multiple wives. So, once there's a currency, in a sense, to exchange for wives, that seems to be what humans do. We see a great example of this on the American plains. So these are mobile hunters and gatherers that are living on the western plains of the U.S., and the horse gets introduced via the Spanish in the 1600s, makes it to the plains. And immediately those horses are kind of co-opted into bride wealth. So those men that can accumulate the largest herds can then exchange them. And we see the rates, as far best we know, the rates of polygyny greatly increase after the introduction of the horse. So this is the idea that if there's a way to monopolize resources, you can also monopolize women. And so, that's one way to think about it ecologically. So why don't we have unbridled polygyny in our own society? Good question, right? Because we got lots of access to wealth in the forms of dollars and banks. And, we have strong societal rules and norms about that. Because the other thing we know is that across the world, throughout human history, the Inca, the Aztec, the Chinese, the Egyptians, when you get these super wealthy at the top, the kings of the world, that can really monopolize resources, they create these huge harems. I mean, there are, these amazing stories about Incan kings having 20,000 women in their harems, that kind of thing. Well, that leaves a whole lot of unhappy men, right?
Right.
If the king controls all those women, there's a lot of unhappy men, and so those societies are really unstable. I mean, nobody wants to tolerate that. There's a lot of unhappy people. The women are unhappy, the men are unhappy, and so those are very unstable societies. And so I think it's in recognition of that, probably, that hundreds of years ago, many industrialized societies start to enact laws about monogamy, so that we basically can have a more stable society.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So let's end on that note, Dr. Kramer. Just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find your work on the internet? Are there any good places there?
Sure. I'm a professor at the University of Utah, and my faculty webpage in the Department of Anthropology has a link to my resume and a lot of the work that we have discussed here today. So thank you for listening. Thank you for your very interesting interview. It was a great pleasure, and I hope maybe I've got some evolutionary anthropology converts out there. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for your time, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Okay, thank you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please do not forget to support the channel. You can go over to Patreon at patreon.com/the Dissenter. And you also have links to PayPal in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, leave a comment, and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and supporters, Karen Litska and Blanchett, Paraga Larsen, Laguerrero, Francis Fordens, Frederic Sunda, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whitting, Bernardo Wolf, Tim Hollacy, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Forrest Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Voss, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetriou, Robert Windager, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Columba, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Mikkel Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Yevon Bodrenko, Hal Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslam Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yassila Dez Araújo, Ethan Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londoño Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Elman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Taffini, Akian Gilligan, Sérgio Quadriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Van Egdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Nirban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.